I'm Reshma Devi, a second year PhD student from the Department of Materials Engineering at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. I work on solid state ionic diffusion in battery materials under the guidance of Dr. Sai Gautam Gopalakrishnan. And today I'll be giving you a brief overview of one of our recent work, which is the effect of exchange correlation functionals on migration barrier estimation in battery materials. Let's get started. So the rate performance of a battery is typically related to the time scales associated with ionic or charge transferent host structures like an electrode or an electrolyte. And it's an important performance determining metric because it affects the application of lithium ion and beyond lithium ion battery technologies in general. And when we're talking about electrode and electrolyte systems, we usually see intercalation systems like spinel or a layered framework. And when you're talking about how diffusion happens here, the activation energy required for the diffusion in these structures essentially affect the rate performance of the battery. So, and this diffusivity of these ions is related to the activation energy via the very famous Arrhenius equation, as we all know. Experimentally, this can be calculated via impedance spectroscopy, nuclear magnetic resonance, etc. But what we are trying to do here is to see how accurately can we predict them computationally. So that's the objective of our work. So the computational tool that we're using here is natural elastic band calculation, or NEB. And this particular method is a commonly used methodology in order to estimate activation energies. And it typically uses 4 to 20 images between the initial and the final sites. And it actually mimics an elastic band, which on optimizing reaches a minimum energy path, or MEP. And the activation energies can be obtained once we achieve the minimum energy path. So the force projections at each of these images are so designed such that it ensures equal spacing and equal distribution of images about the elastic band. A slight modification which is done to this natural elastic band calculation is the climbing image approximation, where the image having the highest amount of energy is kind of chosen, and the parallel component of the force at that particular point is loosened. So that will result in the identification of the saddle point energy with much higher accuracy. So the NEB predicted barriers are usually done in conjunction with density function theory based tools. And therefore, any approximation that goes into DFT will be affecting the natural elastic band calculations predicted barrier as such. So on analyzing this factor, we found that 3 important handles can be like in turn affecting the accuracy of the barriers that are predicted using NEB calculations. The first handle or the first factor happens to be the exchange correlation functional choice itself. So we have chosen 3 functionals here. The first one being SCAN functional, which is strongly constrained and appropriately normed functional, generalized gradient approximation, or GGA, and the corresponding Hubbard-U corrected functions, that is SCAN+U and GGA+U. The second handle happens to be the addition of uniform background charge, or NLEC. This is basically done in order to ensure charge neutrality is maintained in these systems which do not contain a transition metal ion. The third handle happens to be the addition of climbing image approximation. This doesn't have anything to do with the exchange correlation functional, but it is a small modification to the NEB functional NEB calculation itself. So we try to vary these 3 handles and see how the barriers that are predicted using NEB calculations actually are effective. The systems that we have taken for our studies are these. So we have orthorhombic Li3PO4, tetragonal Na3PS4, spinels like MgTi2S4, MgMn2O4, post-spinels like NaV2O4, olivines like LiFePO4, and layered structures like LiCO02. So totally, there are 6 electrodes and 3 electrolytes. And the basis on which we chose these functionals are the availability of experimental data, heterogeneity of the intercalating ion, we have sodium, magnesium, lithium, and the diversity of the structural frameworks themselves. So, so that our results can be like extrapolated to other battery materials in general. So we try to vary the first handle, that is the functional variation in the case of electrodes, and look at how all 3 handles affect the accuracy in the case of electrolytes. So some of the common observations with respect to electrolytes are given here. So we have the barriers that are plotted for all the 3 electrolyte systems taken. The blue and light blue color correspond to GGA and GGA+CI barriers. Orange and green correspond to SCAN and SCAN+CI. The horizontal lines correspond to the experimentally predicted barriers. The notation NE that is used next to the system's name in the x-axis correspond to the addition of uniform background charge. If NE is not present, it actually means that uniform background charge was not added. So the main observations are addition of NLEC or addition of climbing image does not affect the barriers as such. And the second important observation is EM from SCAN. It tends to be higher than the EM from GGA functional. With respect to electrodes, we have used the same color codes here, except that for GGA+U and SCAN+U, we have used this pink and orange colors. And important observations here are EM from SCAN+U tends to be lower than EM from GGA+U, and EM from SCAN tends to be higher than EM from GGA. Some of the common observations are GGA and SCAN it tends to give some kind of an upper and lower bound to experimental barrier predictions, because it tends to underestimate and overestimate the barriers in the case of systems like MgAc2S4, which is an electrolyte, and systems like LiCO2, which is an electrode. And SCAN has a better numerical accuracy because the mean absolute error that we calculated for SCAN, it tends to be lower than other functions. So to understand these trends in detail, I'll try to explain two systems in the interest of time. The first one being MgMn2O4 spinel. So this has the oxygen anions forming a face-centered cubic lattice, and the octahedral and tetrahedral voids are occupied by the manganese and magnesium ion respectively. The magnesium ion, in order for it to migrate, it has to move from initial tetrahedral site to final tetrahedral site via the octahedral intermediate site. So the initial and the final sites, tetrahedral sites, are represented by the green and purple color here. And the intermediate octahedral site, as you can see, it shares its coordinates with 6 other manganese ions, resulting in the form of a ring-like structure highlighted there by the dashed yellow lines. So here, these two figures actually show the local environment of a migration event, the front and rear view. And the bottom panel shows the minimum energy path. So this is basically the migration energy plotted versus the path distance that was actually covered. And on the right, we have the barriers plotted for each function. So on analyzing these plots, we find the functionals GGA+U, SCAN, and SCAN+U to be closer to the barriers that were predicted experimentally. And GGA tends to underestimate significantly. To understand this, we'll take a look at the magnetic moment plots. So here we have the magnetic moments of each of the transitional metal ions in the structure, whose transitional metal ion numbers are given along the y-axis as a function of the image number. So the image 1 corresponds to the initial site being occupied, and the image 9 corresponds to the final site being occupied. So this is for SCAN function and SCAN+U functional. And we have plotted the magnetic moments in the form of a heat map. And the bottom figure here, it essentially shows the local neighbors corresponding to the initial and the final site for your reference. Magnetic moment value of 4 here corresponds to the manganese in +3 oxidation state, and magnetic moment value of 2.5 corresponds to the manganese in +4 oxidation state. So if you take a look at this, we find that the manganese 4 and 6, which are initially closer to the initial site, they tend to have a higher magnetic moment initially, and then tend to go to a lower value. A similar opposite scenario is observed in the case of manganese 12 and 14, which are closer to the final site. They tend to be lower initially, and then they tend to go to a higher value. So such kind of movement actually means that when the magnesium ion is actually moving from the initial to the final site, it is also being accompanied by a localized electron hopping along with it. Such kind of localized electron hop is actually expected or observed in the case of semiconductor material like MgMn2O4. And this essentially means SCAN+U is kind of capturing it. And similarly, that's the case with SCAN and GGA+U, which I'll not be explaining. But if we take a look at GGA, it does not show any kind of meaningful electron hopping changes as it can be seen here. And also the ground state configuration was predicted by GGA in the case of MgMn2O4. It's cubic spinel, and what is expected is a tetragonal spinel. But this essentially means that GGA is not predicting the underlying electronic structures properly. So here in this particular case of a semiconductor material like MgMn2O4, SCAN, SCAN+U, and GGA+U tend to perform better. Let's move on to a metallic system like LiCO2. So we have the oxygen anions forming the HCP lattice. And in between these lattices, we have the lithium and the cobalt ions occupying the alternate layers. So when the lithium ion moves from the initial to the final site, it can move via 2 mechanisms. The first one being the tetrahedral site hop, or TSH. The second one being oxygen double hop, or ODH. So lithium ion, when it moves from the initial to the final site via the intermediate tetrahedral site, it's called as TSH hop mechanism. And when it moves to the oxygen double site, it is called as ODH mechanism. And ODH, usually because of the higher amount of electrostatic repulsion, it has higher barrier when compared to TSH. We calculated the barriers for both the both the mechanisms, ODH and TSH. And as expected, ODH tends to give a higher barrier than TSH. And when you take a look at the accuracy, SCAN has a better numerical accuracy when compared to experiments, and GGA+U tends to overestimate here. So we'll try to understand that. So this figure again shows the magnetic moments for all of the transition metal ions for GGA+U on the right and other functionals on the left. So when you take a look at the magnetic moment plots here, we find that some kind of magnetic moment changes happening, which is indicated by the color gradients. So this essentially means that there's some kind of electron localization which is happening, which is not expected in a case of a metallic system because all electrons are delocalized. So that is essentially captured in the case of GGA, SCAN, and SCAN+U and compared to GGA+U. So some of the common observations are on analyzing all the systems that were taken for our study. We found SCAN to have a better numerical accuracy. SCAN and SCAN+U, they tend to capture the on-site magnetic moments better. and they don't depend on the nature of the material. And when we take a look at these kind of changes, we also can say that SCAN predicts the electronic structure better. But does this all mean that SCAN is a worth pursuing function? The answer actually lies in looking at the computational time that was taken. So this particular figure shows the relative computational time taken by each of these functions for all the systems with respect to GGA functional. So the zero line here corresponds to the time that was taken by GGA functional, and all the functionals time with respect to that are plotted here. So any time scales in the positive axis correspond to the calculations being slower, and any functional in the negative time scales correspond to the calculations being faster. So on analyzing these plots, we can say that all the functionals SCAN, SCAN+U, GGA+U, they tend to be slower than GGA. SCAN is kind of faster than SCAN+U, but it is very slower when compared to GGA and GGA+U. And when we take a look at convergence difficulties, we face some issues with respect to LiCO02, NaV2O4, etc., with respect to SCAN and SCAN+U NABs. And therefore, we had to use a specific scheme to converge those calculations and obtain the barriers. So on analyzing all of these difficulties, we can say that GGA can be used for a quick estimation of migration barrier, whereas SCAN can be used for higher numerical accuracy. So the major conclusions are migration barriers are very important to be predicted because it affects the rate performance of batteries. And SCAN has a better numerical accuracy, but it comes with a relatively higher amount of computation cost and time. We also found that addition of NLET and climbing image does not affect the barrier magnitude very much, at least in the case of electrolytes. So all of these work are presented in our paper, which is currently under review in NPJ Compumats. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank my professor and my teammates from SciMat Group, SERB for its funding, and IISc's supercomputing facility for helping us complete the calculations, and Professor Kanappa and Dr. Baltej Singh from National University of Singapore for helping us complete some of the NEB calculations which were required for our study. So with that, I would like to conclude, and I would be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Questions?
So when you compare this computational times between various exchange correlation functionals, so did you start the NEB with the same initial guess of path?
Yes. Yeah.
So now that is one way of comparing things. But what if I do a GGA based NEB and take that guess to start my scan? What do you think? Would it not be faster?
Actually, when we face some certain difficulties with respect to NaV2, for example, so we had to use the SCAN-NEB calculations path for initializing the SCAN+U calculations, because even after several restarts, it was not converging. So what we did was we took the highest time that was taken for the SCAN+U calculation alone. We added it with SCAN calculation, the time that was taken to obtain that NEB path. So total time is what is actually plotted here.
Okay. So if you just start with GGA and get your migration barrier and then start with that path, do you think SCAN would still take a lot of time?
It did take a lot of time in certain cases, yeah. In LiFePO4.
Okay, I'm a little confused. So CI, you mean climbing image,
Climbing
right?
image.
So I thought climbing image is just a way of accurately getting the NEB maximum,
Yeah.
the NEB saddle point. So why are you saying that you're not surprised that you get different barriers with CI and without CI? That has to happen, right?
So actually, the accuracy is not very much affected because of the addition of CI. So we expect,
but it shouldn't be, right?
No, it actually CI is basically you add that particular inclusion in order to estimate the barriers with more accuracy. So a regular NEB calculation, if you just do, and then you do a NEB plus CI, you will get better barrier approximation. And that's what has been proved for many systems in literature.
But it's just a way of refining the
highest point
area,
image,
right?
so that you get an estimation of the saddle point.
Yeah,
so
but
once you get
not going to change it drastically, right?
So when the highest point image itself it changes, the entire barrier will change, right? So if it is being if it's being accurately calculated, better than the regular NEB, so obviously the entire barrier will change, right?
Okay, we'll talk about this later.
Sure,
because to me, it seems like it should just refine it slightly, unless you have some really bad NEB with very far apart images or something.
The highest energy point is actually being predicted using CI with a better accuracy. So when that particular energy point changes, the total barrier will change. So,
okay. Yeah, question there?
So for GGA+U and SCAN+U, is there any specific methodology you followed for estimation of Hubbard U? like DFPT?
GGA+, you are asking about Hubbard-U parameters, right? How we obtained it.
Yes.
So GGA+U's Hubbard-U parameter is obtained from materials project. SCAN+U's Hubbard parameter, materials project. So SCAN+U is from one of our previous work from our supervisor. So he had used it for transition metal line systems and he had obtained it. So we use the same parameters here for SCAN+U.
And another question, can you go back to the slide where you presented the activation energy barriers for electrolytes?
Electrolytes, I presented for electrodes.
Yeah, the initially.
Oh, the barriers. Okay, fine.
This one. So the issue with the GGA having excessive delocalization is well known, but what could possibly causing the errors in systems like Na3PS4 and Li3PO4?
Like you're asking Na3PS4. So here, actually, in the case of Na3PS4, we have calculated the migration energies and it has been reported in literature, like when you're computing it computationally, we'll have to account for the defect energies also. So we have not included the defect energies here. Only the migration energies are reported for Na3PS4.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we need to stop and go on to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.